Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the latest episode of The Free Marketeers. My name is Chris, and today I'm very lucky to be joined by Bernstein from the Center for Development and Enterprise. For those of you who haven't encountered Anne or her work or her organization's work before, you're in for a definite treat today. We're going to talk about some serious issues affecting South Africa, but of course, Anne's ideas regarding resolving some of these problems. Just a bit of background, Anne is the founder and executive director of the CDE, and the CDE focuses on inclusive economic growth and democratic consolidation. Anne, thanks so much for being here.
It's a pleasure. I'm delighted to be with you.
And before we get into the sort of substantive policy aspects, I thought we would just start off with you giving a bit of background on the CDE, the kind of work that you guys do, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit of oversight into that.
Sure. So the CDE is an unusual organization in South Africa. We're a totally independent policy think tank, and we focus on development issues and how South Africa can get growth going, much more labor-intensive growth, and a much more skilled workforce. We build networks, and we have good convening power, so we can get people from all parts of South Africa to not only be in the same room, but to actually listen to each other. So we're not a libertarian organization. I feel I should make this clear to this audience. We do think that developing countries need an effective state, and we do think the role of the state is important. And obviously, that's an issue I'm sure we're going to get into when we discuss South Africa.
So I guess the most pressing thing that I want to talk about, and we can then sort of decide, what flows out from that. Everyone's talking about COVID-19 at the moment, but I think the biggest issue probably in South Africa is poverty, sort of grinding poverty, grinding starvation, that kind of thing. At the moment, we have probably more than 11 million unemployed people in South Africa, with ever rising youth unemployment. So, I'm throwing you in at the deep end here, but how do we fix unemployment? Is it a silver bullet? Is it 10 silver bullets? What do you think about that whole issue? Because I think so much flows from that into other aspects of South African life. And I think a lot of things could be alleviated or fixed, at least if that sort of challenge is better addressed by a capable state.
Well, I think so, Chris. I'm pleased we've got to the important issues. It is truly appalling that pre-COVID, South Africa is a country with growing inequality, with enormous poverty, and probably the world's deepest unemployment crisis. Now, there are lots of people who want to talk about unemployment, and they want to separate it from growth. Our view is you can't do that, and that's one of the reasons why we're not making progress. First and foremost, South Africa has to get back to a rising rate of growth. I'm going to leave COVID aside for now. We can come back to how that affects things. But talking about January 2020, we have to get back to growth, and we have to get the fastest possible growth for this society. And that's going to require a package of reforms. And we can all fiddle around the edges. The president likes to tweak things, likes to talk, but nothing much happens. But the fact is we need some fundamental reforms to take place if we are to get the growth we desperately need. And those sorts of reforms are the obvious ones, like we need, without electricity and power, we may as well not talk about growth. That's number one. If we don't deal with our fiscal crisis, which is now so large that it is a dampener on growth, we won't be able to get the growth rates we need. And we won't be able to deal with the fiscal crisis. We need much higher growth in order to deal with South Africa's fiscal challenges, which are large and growing. But there are other things as well. I think in some respects, most importantly, we need a very different attitude to the private sector, to markets and competitive markets, which are absolutely fundamental to get growth going in South Africa. And until there is a recognition that you can't be anti-business and pro-growth, you can't tell me you want to deal with poverty and you're anti-business. You can't do it. And South Africa is living proof of that. So we need a very different attitude in the state, in our leading political alliance, to business, to firms, to competition and markets. Because without that, I don't think we have a chance of dealing with unemployment and poverty. There are many other things. Skills is an absolutely fundamental issue. We do a lot of work on how to reform the basic education system, but clearly that will take time. We have made some progress, but not nearly enough. South Africa wallows at the bottom of all the comparative tables, and many countries that are much poorer than us do much better than us. So it's not money, it's management. It's the right attitudes to how we're going to fix the learning experience for the vast majority of pupils or learners in South Africa. So skills are very important. And in the meanwhile, we are absolutely in favor of importing skills from elsewhere. We should be shouting loud and clear that South Africa needs skills to help build a successful society. And as long as you're not a criminal and you have entrepreneurial or basic or professional skills, we want you. But that's not our attitude. So when it comes to growth, there are a number of absolutely fundamental things we have to do. We have to fix the state-owned companies, which are an enormous drag on the state, on the fiscus, and don't provide efficient and affordable services for the economy. And we keep kind of fiddling around here, pretending that a failing state can manage large modern institutions and provide services efficiently, which they're not doing. So a whole lot of issues that are required to fix growth. But even if we got higher growth, that will not be sufficient. It's necessary, but not sufficient. South Africa needs much more labor-intensive growth. And this is a set of issues that most people don't want to deal with. We have chosen to structure our economy in such a way that we favor capital-intensive growth, we subsidize it, and we do very little to encourage labor-intensive growth. We have to make it much easier for employers to hire. We have to make it less of a hassle, take the risk out of it as much as is possible, and encourage employers to hire more labor. That's our big abundance as a society. So we have a whole lot of recommendations on how to get a much more labor-intensive economy. So when you're talking about unemployment, there are two parts to this. How to get growth, and we won't fix unemployment unless we get much faster growth and sustained growth for a significant period, but also how to build a much more labor-intensive economy so that employers and new firms can start and can hire the mainly unskilled, mainly young people that we have who through no fault of their own have never worked and have very little to offer other than their labor. So that's vitally important. These two buckets of reform that South Africa needs to grasp and deal with as fast as possible in order to even start having an impact on our unbelievably high, catastrophically high unemployment rates.
Oh, I mean, there's so much there that I want to sort of lead on from, but especially the part of making it easier for people to get jobs, to get employment. I mean, I can feel the sense of, are you going to advocate for a low minimum wage? Are you going to advocate for fewer other barriers kind of thing? And then people's concerns around exploitation. So what then happens if businesses or big corporates just, tell someone, I'll give you a job, sure, but I'm going to pay you 100 Rand a day kind of thing, but a job is better than nothing. What do you say to that kind of concern,
Well, there are a number of issues that you've raised, which are really important, and we've thought about a lot. So the first thing is to know that the government does not pay the national minimum wage in the expanded public works program. That's important information. And so the question one has to ask is, if it's all right for the government to not pay the national minimum, why must other companies? So that's one question. The second is that we do need to change the collective bargaining deal that we have, where outrageously the people around a table, big business and big labor, can make a deal that suits them, and they have every right to do that, but then send it to the minister who can expand that to all the people who weren't around that table, the unemployed, the small businesses, the new firms. So that's a second part of this. And there are a number of other reforms that we would talk about, but let me talk a bit about one of the concrete proposals we are making, and where over the past few years we see more and more voices of importance edging towards the suggestion that we're making. So nobody knows what would happen in South Africa if we actually got what I would like, and probably many other people would like, which is a much more open labor market. But we also need to be cognizant of the enormous struggle that organized labor has had to achieve the wages and conditions that they have done since the apartheid era and before, since the late 70s, actually. And we have come with an idea that we think could work in South African politics today. We are proposing and have been arguing for quite a while that we should test out a special economic zone in South Africa, which is designed to attract investors in labor-intensive factories, as they've done almost all over the world, where people are paid. You can get to the minimum wage if you add in the employment tax incentive. And so we're finessing that issue, if you like. So we're saying all workers in this zone must be eligible for the expanded tax incentive, but factories must be able to negotiate piecework or after hours and a number of other things, factory by factory. We need to maintain basic health and safety standards, and we need to probably run this zone by the private sector, or at least a public-private partnership that has an incentive to make sure the zone works. So the idea here is, let's test out what would happen if we got a labor market regime closer to certainly what I would want and what competitive other countries have. How would we do? And maybe this reform zone, if you like, maybe if it works, we could get momentum to help unlock the politics in the country. There's an ideal place for such a zone, which is in Coega, in the Nelson Mandela Bay municipality, or right next to Coega. We've sunk investment already, so we're not really asking for serious additional funds for this. We don't think you should subsidize the companies. All we're saying is, let's create a special geographic area where we could try and attract some of those many millions of jobs that are leaving China because wages and conditions are now much higher, and where people want to diversify their supply chains, and as a footprint into the African market and beyond. So we think there's a plausible case. There's absolutely no doubt that Nelson Mandela Bay and the Coega area would be a very attractive, could be globally competitive. You have a big port, much nicer place to live in PE, very nice place, than in Ethiopia or a number of other places I can think of. So we have a competitive living environment. We need to open the doors so that those factories can bring in the skills that South Africa doesn't really have anymore. Skills to run a highly competitive, very productive but low margin factory making T-shirts or assembling toys or whatever. So we need to adjust the immigration rules and a number of other things. But this could be a really viable experiment. Now, the National Treasury is very close to, if you look at their reform document, they're saying something similar. We should try out experiments such as a special economic zone. The ANC recovery document from last year was talking about the importance of low-end manufacturing and doing this through special economic zones. The high-level panel report under former President Kgalema Motlanthe to Parliament a few years ago also was backing this idea. And Joel Ntsitsenzi, member of the ANC National Executive Committee, is certainly inclined to this idea and has publicly said this. The key, though, we're not calling for a holus bolus throwing out of all South Africa's labor law. This has been negotiated, and it's really important that workers in existing firms, with the conditions and the agreements that they've reached with their employers, that they do not feel their rights are being undermined. You won't get it otherwise. The politics won't get it. So we're saying we want some carefully calibrated reforms that we think are sufficient to try out this kind of a zone and see what happens. And so that's, if you like, a very practical suggestion of how we could move this debate beyond this gridlock and the terrible situation we're in, and experiment in this one part of the economy with, can South Africa be a competitive location for low-end manufacturing? And we think the odds are good. No guarantees, but we think the odds are good.
I was just thinking, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, that's, quote unquote operational now. There's still barriers to it becoming fully operational. It might only take 10 to 15 years for everything. But do you think that kind of broad overview that policy overview for Africa will push countries like South Africa in the direction of sort of special economic zones, making it easier for people to come in with different skills, kind of thing? Do you think there's potential there, or any of your knowledge on that area tell you that maybe we shouldn't focus too much on that kind of thing?
Look, I'm not an expert on the African Free Trade Agreement, but this is very early days. Let's all be completely realistic. So I'm in favor of removing barriers to trade. I'm in favor of removing efficiency barriers across borders. You know how much it costs companies in time and money when they've got to get lots and lots of documents, they've got to wait at borders, all those sorts of issues. I'm in favor of that. There are two big things that have to happen. One, this has to actually be implemented in a serious way. And two, you've got to think through your migration policy, because with goods come people. Now, migration is a very important policy issue for South Africa. Unfortunately, we've got so many other emergency crises and issues that this isn't top of the list. But this is an area where CDE has done a lot of work. We're very much in favor of skilled immigration into South Africa. We need to manage unskilled immigration in a far more serious and believable way than we have up until now. And so the free trade area is going to raise that issue in very, very quickly and will push it to the forefront. So I think there's a lot of hype. I don't think we're very far down the road yet, from what I can gather. So not yet is my answer to your question.
I won't bet my house or anything on it then. So good to know for my own self-interest. I wanted to ask you about something that has been in the news a lot in the last week or so. And before I get onto that, to everyone watching, thank you, of course, for being here. If you have questions for Anne, please type those into the comment section, and then I'll read those out to her. So my question is around the regulations recently imposed on restaurants and how they might affect that area. So, we're in this post-pandemic world kind of thing, and we know that a lot of small businesses, restaurants are struggling, especially in the tourism sector in South Africa with currently lockdown level 3. So do you see any sort of rationale behind these regulations? Can you talk a bit about the sort of environment in which they were conceived, that kind of thing?
I wish we were in a post-pandemic world, Chris. I think we're right in the thick of it, and the death rate is much higher in January than we had at the height of the first wave last year. So we're in this pandemic, and it's not going to go away very soon. And certainly South Africa doesn't yet have vaccines. So I think in general, one would have to say that at the beginning, this was a great shock to everybody. Nobody knew how to handle this. And I think at the first sort of period, the government handled it as reasonably well as could be expected. Nobody had a playbook for this. But since then, I think they haven't learned from a lot of the mistakes or the things we've all been learning along the way, and certainly in how they've dealt with business. Right. I can see no reason whatsoever why they couldn't have sat down with business, from tobacco to alcohol to the restaurants and hospitality industry, before December, and said, how are we going to deal with this? Things are getting worse. We're going into a second wave. What would make the most sense in the area you know best? But certainly in terms of alcohol, they just did it. In terms of tourism, the garden route and elsewhere, they just locked it down. No consultation, when clearly there could have been. We have to protect the population and try and have as few deaths as possible, which is a complicated question in the second wave, but why not talk to business? So I think they've handled this very badly. We know that tobacco, the last sort of lockdown, there is enormous shady business. We've just increased this. In terms of alcohol, you want to know, does nobody understand what happened with prohibition in America in the 1930s? So I just think that you can't talk of a solid, constructive business-government relationship when there isn't discussion on how best to do the things that might need to be done. We can all debate, should we lock down in this way or that way, or how we handle some tricky issues. But the way that government has dealt with business seems to me to have been very weak and enormously costly. So who better than South African breweries to help distribute the vaccine all over the country? They can get a cold beer to every village in South Africa, but they weren't consulted on the latest alcohol lockdown or the one before. They are halting investment. They are now starting to have to see off some 550 temporary workers. Consul, which is intimately related to this value chain, which I'm not sure the government even understood. Consul has held back on an investment, a significant new investment. So how government has dealt with business through this crisis up till now is very different from the president calling investment summits. And you wonder, what's going on here? What is the game plan? So I think that enormous swathes of small businesses are at risk or have closed already. Of course, capitalism's all about creative destruction, and new opportunities arise, and some of the stronger businesses will survive. But I'm not sure it had to be like this, and I certainly think the government should have sat down and consulted with the industries concerned. Retail, hospitality, alcohol, which has many different parts, from wine to other stuff. This is a complex set of relationships. And then, of course, the cigarette ban seems crazy to me the last time. I'm pleased they didn't do it this time. But there are just too many shady questions and unresolved issues at a time when South Africa desperately needs to keep every firm alive that has a chance of success, to preserve all those jobs that have jobs, if you know what I mean, real jobs. We need to preserve these as much as we can. And then we need as much tax revenue as possible. And this seems to not have been a strategic, across government approach to how to deal with the very difficult circumstances that we face.
Speaking of a capable state, that sort of idea and the state-owned enterprises and, the role that the government should play in society and life, I know that, I could open the can of worms to a very abstract discussion, which I love. So, but I won't go too far into that. But just in terms of, procuring the vaccine kind of thing. On the one hand, we were told that there isn't money for that, but on the other hand, we can do a 10 billion rand bailout for SAA. So I know it's difficult to say ideally because we don't live in an ideal world, but for you, what now, hopefully heading out of the second peak and into some sort of better place, what should the government prioritize in terms of their own spending? What sort of SOEs could they let go of or minimize? What do you think about that aspect?
Look, I think the way in which Treasury and the government as a whole and the health ministry have handled paying for the vaccine has been extremely confusing and unimpressive. So why they had to end up at the Solidarity Fund on the morning where they had to meet the 4 o'clock deadline and they couldn't find a few 100 million rand beats me. And I'm not sure we understand exactly what's going on. It's quite clear we could find, let's call it 20 billion to acquire the vaccine, but it's less than that because the medical aids are going to pay for the 7 million members and then double that number from the medical aids. That's 14 million. We need about 40 million people vaccinated in order to get herd immunity, 67% of the population, they're saying. So it's less than the 20 million. On the other hand, the costs of rollout, nobody seems to be talking about, and those will be, I don't know what they'll be. You'll have to get lots of syringes and storage and whatever. So nobody seems to be talking about that. So it's real money, but as a middle-income country, we can obviously find that money in the budget. We could, there are lots of things we could do. I wouldn't put 10.5 billion into SAA. I read the other day, we spend nearly 100 million on the Deputy President's security detail, which the mind boggles as to why we have to do that. If you just took the entire cabinet security budget and said, what is this? The president needs security, sure. But I'm not sure who else and who's, so I think there's money you could find. Now, we're obviously already cutting the budget dramatically because of reduced tax revenue. So we come back to the big issues. It would be the most important priority facing South Africa today, as you and I speak, Chris, is to acquire the vaccine and to roll it out as fast and as efficiently and as comprehensively as possible. And I don't think this has to be done the way the government has said it has to be done. The Western Cape is trying to acquire the vaccine for that government. And if they get that ahead and are rolling out before the rest of the country, this will put enormous pressure on the government, and rightly so. So speaking personally, I've been extremely unimpressed with how the vaccine issue has been handled, communicated, and is being thought about so far. So for me, the vaccine is the most important issue on the table. Top priority, number one. Number two, electricity and power. What is the delay? Why can't we do it properly? Why does the minister seem to operate on his own time schedule, different from the president's? Why does nobody ever get fired in this country? What do you have to do as a cabinet minister to actually be fired? Because the president keeps promising things. in the 2018 State of the Nation speech, the 2019, the 2020 speech, but nothing ever happens. Or not much. There are some things, but not much. And nobody ever takes accountability for why things didn't happen. So I think we have to recognize the a very hard thing to face up to is that South Africa's state is incredibly weak and corrupt. And that has consequences for people like me, my organization, calling on the government to do this, this, and this, for everybody who calls on the government to do A, B, and C, and for the president. And until we grapple with this issue, I don't think we're going to get very far. So there's lots and lots of talk since the recovery program of governments was released about infrastructure. But you've got to reorient a very statist state, a very weak state, to now change its approach to engage with the private sector, learn how to manage the private sector so you're not taken to the cleaners, and get into a relationship where we can get private sector expertise and resources and the money to build the infrastructure we need. That's just one question. A second question would be, so what are the priorities when it comes to infrastructure? And I don't think we've had that discussion as a society. Where is the key need for infrastructure that will give us the biggest bang for the buck in terms of growth and jobs? So there are a lot of issues on the existing priority list for the country that haven't been fully discussed or explored or unpacked. And too many people just assume we're all talking about the same thing when actually a lot of the words and phrases or proposals mean different things. Take localization, which is a top priority for the government's recovery plan. We're going to reindustrialize through localization. Well, what does that mean? I'm in favor of trade and comparative advantage, and South Africa finding niches in the world economy where we're better than anybody else. To just say, oh, and we're going to use local firms to supply the infrastructure demand. We're going to use local firms all over the country. This is nonsense. These local firms don't just emerge. So I think I've written about this. I am very concerned about the government's approach to the recovery strategy. I think it recognizes the weak state, but then it immediately assumes the state can do everything after that. It's very statist. It hasn't heard the fundamental cry from business, which is that you have to deregulate and free up the economy, and that actually the only capacity or the main capacity South Africa has today is in its private sector. Whether it's rural or urban South Africa, that's where capacity lies. There's a little bit in our cities, in our big metros, but not as much as there once was. And that's the reality. And this plan is not built on that. So the priorities, we're just working on this at the moment, actually. I think the priorities for the country have to do with this hard question of who will implement. Don't assume. It has to do with the fiscal crisis, the electricity generation need, which we've been talking about for so long that it's hard to understand why we haven't made more progress on both the Eskom debt, but also freeing up the markets and the private sector to provide, and the mines and everyone else who can generate electricity, so that as a matter of absolute urgency, we get as much electricity as possible. That just doesn't seem to be there. And it's very puzzling. Of course, the state-owned companies are a great big mess, the big ones. There's so many, I don't know all of them. There's 780. But the big ones that are fiscally important and that are economically really fundamental, I don't think we've made nearly enough progress on what to do, what to privatize, what must be in the state, what's essential, what isn't. It's just a great big mess. So I think the country suffers from a real lack of leadership. And that makes it hard to think about what the key priorities are and how they're going to be implemented.
I wanted to ask you about some sort of case studies or examples of where certain policies have been implemented and where they've proven to be successful. Now, I know that one should bear in mind that each country has its own context, of course, and its own history. So just because something worked in Korea, South Korea, doesn't mean it's going to work in South Africa, for example, or because it worked in the UK, it's going to work here. But are there one or two country case studies in the last, I guess, 20 or 30 years that stand out to you where we could sort of take one or two things and drop them into South Africa?
Look, I believe very strongly that comparative understanding and research and knowledge is very important. For you look elsewhere, then you see your own society in a different light. Very important part of how we move forward. I don't like to talk about models. I don't think there are models. I think that because for all the reasons that you've spelt out, I think there are important lessons we can learn from elsewhere. So the one lesson is the one about low-end manufacturing. If you think about it, all the countries in the world that have not discovered oil since the 19th century have progressed through low-end jobs. There is no other way to go. And lots of people say, oh, we don't want that for South Africa. And then you say, well, that's fine. What is your suggestion? If you don't want to do what everyone else in the world has done, what should we do? And I think the last 20, 25 years in South Africa have been a phenomenal and very negative experiment. So where we have the highest unemployment rate, we have declining low-skilled jobs, and we have a massive population that are not skilled. And so through no fault of their own, generally, they're only fit for low-skilled jobs. So that would be one big lesson from the rest of the world that South Africa refuses to learn. Who would have thought that dirt-poor Ethiopia could attract a large number of leading multinational companies and sourcing firms and textile firms to that country and then participate in global supply chains? They don't even have a workforce that is work ready. I went to look at some of these, and that's what the employers talk about. It's like the miners used to talk at the beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century in South Africa. They would talk about South African laborers were not work ready. That's what you're hearing in Ethiopia today. So who would have thought you could get to be part of global supply chains from there? And they have. So that's one big global lesson. I think another big global lesson is something we took from the discovery some 15 years ago about the enormous number of private schools for the poor that existed in India and many other developing countries in Africa and elsewhere. And I managed to get resources to research this and called together the country's leading education experts. And they said, you're mad. There are very few, or they're all a bunch of crooks. And we said, well, we've got the money, we're going to do it. By the way, how did you do your research? Oh, no, we took it from the census, or we phoned people. I said, okay, we're going to walk the streets, and we're going to make a map in 6 areas of South Africa, from Umtata to the northern, I'm trying to think where it was. It's sort of Limpopo area. Quite rural, deep rural Limpopo, to Hillbrow, to Umtata, and so on. We're going to walk the streets and we're going to map where the public school is and where the private schools are. And this is quite a long time ago now, but the researchers all came back with their eyes on stalks. And it eventually turned out that since 1994, South Africa had created more private schools for poorer people than government schools. About 3 years ago, we did the sums, and Gauteng has 30% schools are private. Not the St. John's, obviously included in there, St. Mary's, St. John's, but much more affordable schools for poorer people, many of which are offering a better quality of education. So that's another, and there are some chains of schools as well, which is very important. So that's another global lesson we've been able to bring to South Africa. And there are a lot of others, but this is an area we do focus on a lot. And one must do comparative research and learn what's worked in other places and what's failed, and then not plonk in a model, but think hard about what have we learned and what might work in the South African circumstances vis-a-vis transport or education or health or whatever. So I'm not an across-the-board sort of person. I like to look at where South Africa has capacity and what we could do that would actually help. So there are lots of learnings in cities and elsewhere.
I want you to give me the black and white answer. So when you give me the complicated answer, then I don't know how to process that, but I appreciate it. I wanted to ask you a simple, but also, I guess, far-reaching question about the national minimum wage. Let's say, for example, that you freeze that for 1 year. Do you think that would give small businesses more room to hire more people, kind of thing? Would that be one less burden off their shoulders? Do you think it's that simple, or do you think I'm wrong in thinking in that sort of direction?
Well, let me turn it a bit, Chris. I don't think a national minimum wage was a good idea for South Africa when it was introduced. I think that we had sectoral minimum wages, and that seemed to be working much better, sort of bodies closer to the particular sector and the circumstances of that sector setting the minimum wage. I would have preferred that. We have it now, and I don't think we're going to go back from this. So there are a number of things that are very important. It's really important that the objection process to the setting of the minimum wage is made as accessible to smaller companies, small firms, rural firms, small town firms, peri-urban firms as possible. So it has to be real, the objection process. Secondly, it seems to me we shouldn't be thinking of big increases at all, which was proposed late last year. We have to look at, there are employment consequences of this, and especially in the midst of this terrible pandemic. I don't think 1 year is enough to do anything. I think one has to think hard about the terrible economic situation we will be in when we come out of this pandemic. If, in what form we come out, it's all a bit vague. And how, I'll turn the question another way. How do we make the environment as conducive as possible for small firms to get going, to expand, to start up, to survive, to not close down? And how do we do that for medium-sized firms as well? So if you looked at the environment from an employment perspective and a growth perspective, I think one would have very different priorities. Here's a thing not to do from the rest of the world. I'm convinced by a lot of people about the problems with the World Bank's Doing Business Index. There are a whole lot of issues, but they're very general questions applicable across the world. Now, South Africa, the president said he wanted to go up 50 places in a good way. 2019 State of the Nation address, I think, yes. And well, we haven't heard much about that, but you could do very well in going up on the World Bank's Doing Business Index, and it could have absolutely no impact on your growth. People like Ricardo Hausman and Lon Pritchard and a number of others would argue this from empirical research. I would much rather, here's a really good priority. If we said the president's going to appoint I don't know, a team of 3 really, really, really market-oriented lawyers and business people. And they are going to, in 2 months, identify for him the key regulations that must go. And if they can't go very quickly because of legal and other processes, we want to turn the onus around, that if you haven't heard from the regulating authority in a month, you can go ahead and do what you want to do. So, let's turn the whole thing around. So deregulation is, I think, a not very helpful slogan. We've got to get much more practical and specific. How do we do this quickly? And how do we make sure that we get rid of the right regulations and not, ones that might be important in Kenya, but are not important here? So this is a very big topic, and I think you can do it differently. So obviously wages matter. Wages matter. We know that. And I think that probably what is happening in the country is, in order to survive, companies are putting people on half time, on less time. They're doing anything they can to preserve jobs and survive. And I suspect that the regulations and all sorts of things are being, they're being flexible with all of this because it's the only way you can survive. And it's not good for a society to have laws that people don't obey. I would much rather have laws that are appropriate and regulations that are appropriate, because otherwise you undermine the rule of law.
This is a more abstract question, but one thing that I definitely wanted to get your take on before we looked at wrapping up, and then I'll look at a few of the questions in the comments. So one thing that has, I guess, been on my mind about South Africa and the sort of mindset is moving from what I call the redistributionist mindset to a growth mindset, or a transformation, a good radical economic transformation mindset. So how do you think we can move from thinking we can just redistribute people into prosperity, growth, that kind of thing, to people realizing that they've got the tools themselves, or should be enabled to have the tools to generate their own economic activity and growth?
Look, let me put it this way. I think one of the most effective tools of redistribution and opening up opportunity to those people who've been denied it for so long is to give them a good education. That's number one. So if you're serious about the position of the poor and the unemployed in South Africa, let's talk about how we improve basic education and the skills system. Let's do it seriously. Secondly, we know from international evidence that the best form of transformation and empowerment is a fast-growing society. And if you can add into that a more labor-intensive society and more effectively managed cities, we would redistribute opportunity in a generation, and even less. So I am very much in favor of talking about poverty, historical disadvantage, and discrimination in this country, and focusing laser-like on what is required to expand opportunities for all those millions and millions of people who've been denied them for so long. I'm not really so interested in the rhetoric. I think there's been too much. And I'm not really interested in empowering the elite over and over and over again. South Africa spends far too much time in, if you like, blackening the top rather than making the bottom better. And that's, I think, a much better way to think about all of this. But make no mistake about it, without growth, without an effective state, without a more labor-intensive economy and better education, then I think people who want to talk about redistribution should be laughed out of the room. Now, this isn't to say that today we shouldn't have assistance for the many, far too many poor people in our society. I am in favor of the current grant to people. It seems to work really well. It seems to get to the right people. And there is evidence that it is helping people to look for a job or to just have a better chance. So I would support that. That is a big form of redistribution. We also have a lot of redistribution in addition to that. So people often want to talk about redistribution as though it's a new thing in South Africa. We're actually a very redistributive state, whether at local government level with water, electricity, and I'm not sure what else. In terms of housing, in terms of land reform, there are a lot of redistribution policies on our books. I think in many ways, many of these should stay, but much more important is to get people empowered so they can make the choices you and I make about our lives and are not dependent on the state. So I am very open to a discussion on inequality and poverty in South Africa and how we expand opportunity. I want to start from some basic principles of employment and education and more effectively managed urbanization. It really matters. If you push the poor out of the city, it's much harder to run the city viably, and it's much harder to connect the poor to opportunity. So we've done a lot of work on densifying our cities, which I think would be a much better focus, priority than the RDP housing policy, just as a for instance, and where you're mainly seeing small black firms doing this redevelopment in our cities and providing affordable accommodation for people. So I think, we need to think much more deeply and hard about what's worked over the last 20, 25 years and what not through malintention, but what hasn't worked. This is a good time to think about that. And why are we in such a terrible situation? How do we get much more effective at opening opportunities, expanding opportunities for poorer people wherever they live?
On a sort of final note, and I think this will also be a chance for you to give your, parting thoughts and parting pearls of wisdom. So the importance of, or potential importance of trade schools. Maybe in South Africa, we tend to place too much importance on, kids have to go to high school and then to universities and take that sort of path, and that's the only way to success kind of thing. So do you think that element of talking more about like going to a trade school and using that to unlock value in your life could be useful? And then, of course, any other parting thoughts and wisdom that you might have?
Look, there's a global debate about how much attention and energy should be put on university attendance versus going to get a trade or a vacation. And there's no doubt South Africa needed to get many more Black South Africans into the university I went to and the other universities. And we're doing that. Not, I don't think it's perfect yet, but we've dramatically increased the numbers, which is good. South Africa needs we need more effective skills training. So I think the strategy has been for a long time, we want a high wage, high skill economy. And I think that's what's failed. We don't have that. What we have is a low skill workforce, predominantly unemployed, and a much higher sort of first world type of economy, which needs high skills. We need that. We shouldn't be inhibiting our globally competitive top end of the market. But we can be globally competitive in other areas as well. And I am in favor of looking seriously at short courses for people who don't get a matric, at what we offer people who do get a matric but don't go to university, and how we can improve the status and make it more attractive for people to go and do all sorts of computer coding or trades that don't seem all that attractive in some circles. Of course, you have to then look at your skills training system And I don't think we've looked hard enough at what the role is of market-oriented, profit-making entities in training and skills, at what the big companies can offer, or smaller companies, and what the state could or should offer. What I do know is that our present TVETs are very expensive and have low throughput and we think low results. But the data on this is not very good at all. So I think that whole area of what you're opening up is very important, Chris, and I agree with you. It needs more thought. There are lots of sort of vague ideas being thrown around, but there isn't sort of rigorous work and a serious set of proposals on the table. You want me to make some final comments or, well,
No pressure or anything. I mean, it's not like you're the president. I'm putting you in the presidential seat now. So if you are the president, what are you going to do for us in the next 5 years? What's your 5-year plan?
The president, well, South Africa needs a different cabinet. We need to place much higher value on professionalism and fit for purpose people. And there are many people, black and white, in our society who are not in government, who could do a far better job than our present bunch. So the quality of who is in cabinet, who's running things in our metros, in our provinces and in key departments really, really, really matters. That's number one. There's some things there that are in the president's domain. If I were a reforming president, and we've thought a lot about this, I would have a team of people around me who are absolutely world-class, who are absolutely committed to my 5 reform priorities. I would have 5 reform priorities, and people who both understand the politics and the how to leverage bureaucracies to actually deliver. I think that's really important. And I would use the terrible crisis that we're in, the pandemic, unemployment, growth, fiscal, everything. I would use this as a lever to say, we have to do things differently. And this is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to call on the best people in our society to help deliver. So I think it's an attitude and a mindset and a realization that South Africa is more important than the unity of a political party. That's enough. Otherwise, I'd get into trouble.
Well, we wouldn't want that now, would we? Anne, I have to thank you very much for your time today and for your insights. I mean, everyone knows the challenges that South Africa is facing, but, you know, with people like you out there putting out these ideas, hopefully we're heading in some sort of good, productive direction. So we can only hope and we can only try and spread these ideas and engagement and talk about them and discuss them and hope that people, you know, use their own voice. I mean, all citizens can impact government, and I think South Africans need to realize that their own voices and what impact they could have. So, Anne, thank you very much. Viewers, to all of those of you who joined in today, thank you so much for watching. We hope you found it enjoyable and insightful. Please remember to like the video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and please also share the video all over your different social media platforms. We'll have much more content coming very soon. But for now, we'll say stay safe out there, look after yourselves and after your families, and we'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, Chris. Bye.